They looked at the broken thing. "Oh, come on now," Jake said, disagreeing mostly out of habit. "It's not like—" He made an inarticulate gesture. "It can't just—" Everyone knew what he was thinking. Certainly there were demons in the world, but they were like Telu's angels. They were like heroes and kings. They belonged in stories. They belonged out there. Tobolan the Great called up fire and lightning to destroy demons. Telu broke them in his hands and sent them howling into the nameless void. Your childhood friend didn't stomp one to death on the road to Baden Brit. It was ridiculous. Coat ran his head through his red hair, then broke the silence. "There's one way to tell for sure," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Iron or fire." He brought out a bulging leather purse. "In the name of God," Graham pointed out, "demons fear three things: cold iron, clean fire, and the holy name of God." The innkeeper's mouth pressed itself into a straight line that was not quite a frown. "Of course," he said as he emptied his purse onto the table, then fingered through the jumbled coins, heavy silver talents and thin silver bits, copper jots, broken halfpennies, and iron drabs. "Does anyone have a shim?" "Just use a drab," Jake said. "That's good iron." "I don't want good iron," the innkeeper said. "Drab has too much carbon in it. It's almost steel." "He's right," the smith's apprentice said, "except it's not carbon. You use coke to make steel. Coke and lime." The innkeeper nodded deferentially to the boy. "You'd know best, young master. It's your business, after all." His long fingers finally found a shim in the pile of coins. He held it up. "Here we are." "What will it do?" Jake asked. "Iron kills demons." Cub's voice was uncertain. "But this one's already dead. It might not do anything." "One way to find out." The innkeeper met each of their eyes briefly, as if measuring them. Then he turned purposely back to the table, and they edged farther away. Coat pressed the iron shim to the black side of the creature, and there was a short, sharp, crackling sound, like a pine log snapping in a hot fire. Everyone startled, then relaxed when the black thing remained motionless. Cobb and the others exchanged shaky smiles, like boys spooked by a ghost story. Their smiles went sour as the room filled with the sweet, acrid smell of rotting flowers and burning hair. The innkeeper pressed the shim onto the table with a sharp click. "Well," he said, brushing his hands against his apron, "I guess that settles that. What do we do now?" Hours later, the innkeeper stood in the doorway of the Waystone and let his eyes relax to the darkness. Footprints of lamplight from the inn's windows fell across the dirt road and the doors of the smithy across the way. It was not a large road, nor well-traveled. It didn't seem to lead anywhere, as some roads do. The innkeeper drew a deep breath of autumn air and looked around restlessly, as if waiting for something to happen. He called himself Coat. He had chosen the name carefully when he came to this place. He had taken a new name for most of the usual reasons, and for a few unusual ones as well, not the least of which was the fact that names were important to him. Looking up, he saw 1,000 stars glittering in the deep velvet of a night with no moon. He knew them all, their stories and their names. He knew them in a familiar way, the way he knew his own hands. Looking down, Coates sighed without knowing it and went back inside. He locked the door and shuttered the wide windows of the inn as if to distance himself from the stars and all their varied names. He swept the floor methodically, catching all the corners. He washed the tables and the bar, moving with a patient efficiency. At the end of an hour's work, the water in his bucket was still clean enough for a lady to wash her hands in. Finally, he pulled a stool behind the bar and began to polish the vast array of bottles nestled between the two huge barrels. He wasn't nearly as crisp and efficient about this chore as he had been with the others, and it soon became obvious the polishing was only an excuse to touch and hold. He even hummed a little, although he did not realize it, and would have stopped himself if he had known. As he turned the bottles in his long, graceful hands, the familiar motion eased a few tired lines from his face, making him seem younger, certainly not yet 30. Not even near 30. Young for an innkeeper. Young for a man with so many tired lines remaining on his face. Coat came to the top of the stairs and opened the door. His room was austere, almost monkish. There was a black stone fireplace in the center of the room, a pair of chairs, and a small desk. The only other furniture was a narrow bed with a large, dark chest at its foot. Nothing decorated the walls or covered the wooden floor. There were footsteps in the hall, and a young man stepped into the room carrying a bowl of stew that steamed and smelled of pepper. His eyes were dark and charming, with a quick smile and cunning eyes. "You haven't been this late in a span of days," he said as he handed over the bowl. "There must have been good stories tonight, Reshi." Reshi was another of the innkeeper's names, a nickname almost. The sound of it tugged one corner of his mouth into a wry smile as he sank into the deep chair in front of the fire. So what did you learn today, Bast? Today, master, I learned why great lovers have better eyesight than great scholars. And why is that, Bast? Coat asked, amusement touching the edges of his voice. Bast closed the door and returned to sit in the second chair, turning it to face his teacher and the fire. He moved with a strange delicacy and grace, as if he were close to dancing. Well, Reshi, all the rich books are found inside where the light is bad, but lovely girls tend to be out in the sunshine and therefore much easier to study without risk of injuring one's eyes. Coat nodded. But an exceptionally clever student could take a book outside, thus bettering himself without fear of lessening his much-loved faculty of sight. I thought the same thing, Reshi, being, of course, an exceptionally clever student. Of course. But when I found a place in the sun where I could read, a beautiful girl came along and kept me from doing anything of the sort, Bast finished with a flourish. Coat sighed. Am I correct in assuming you didn't manage to read any of Selim Tincture today? Bast managed to look somewhat ashamed. Looking into the fire, Coat tried to assume a stern face and failed. Ah, Bast, I hope she was lovely as a warm wind in the shade. I'm a bad teacher to say it, but I'm glad. I don't feel up to a long bout of lessons right now. There was a moment of silence. Carter was attacked by a Skraeling tonight. Bast's easy smile fell away like a cracked mask, leaving his face stricken and pale. The Skrael? He came halfway to his feet as if he would bolt from the room, then gave an embarrassed frown and forced himself back down into his chair. How do you know? Who found his body? He's still alive, Bast. He brought it back. There was only one. There's no such thing as one Skraeling, Bast said flatly. You know that. I know, Coat said. The fact remains, there was only one. And he killed it? Bast said. It could have been a Skraeling. Maybe. Bast. It was one of the Skrael. I saw it. Coat gave him a serious look. He was lucky, that's all. Even so, he was badly hurt. 48 stitches. I used up nearly all my gut. Coat picked up his bowl of stew. If you want an ass, tell them my father was a caravan guard who taught me how to clean and stitch a wound. They were too shocked to ask about it tonight, but tomorrow some of them might get curious. I don't want that. He blew into his bowl, raising a cloud of steam around his face. What did you do with the body? I didn't do anything with it, Coat said pointedly. I am just an innkeeper. This sort of thing is quite beyond me. Reshi, you can't just let them muddle through this on their own. Coat sighed. They took it to the priest. He did all the right things for all the wrong reasons. Bast opened his mouth, but Coat continued before he could say anything. Yes, I made sure the pit was deep enough. Yes, I made sure there was rowan wood in the fire. Yes, I made sure it burned long and hot before they buried it. And yes, I made sure that no one kept a piece of it as a souvenir. He scowled, his eyebrows drawing together. I'm not an idiot, you know. Bast visibly relaxed, settling back into his chair. I know you're not, Reshi, but I wouldn't trust half these people to piss leeward without help. He looked thoughtful for a moment. I can't imagine why there was only one. Maybe they died coming over the mountains, Coat suggested. All but this one. It's possible, Bast admitted reluctantly. Maybe it was that storm from a couple days back, Coat pointed out. A real wagon temper, as we used to say back in the troop. All the wind and rain might have scattered one loose from the pack. I like your first idea better, Reshi, Bast said uncomfortably. 3 or 4 Skrael would go through this town like a hot knife through butter. More like several hot knives through several dozen farmers, Bast said dryly. These people can't defend themselves. I bet there aren't 6 swords in this whole town. Not that swords would do much good against the Skrael. There was a long moment of thoughtful silence. After a moment, Bast began to fidget. Any news? Coat shook his head. They didn't get to the news tonight. Carter disrupted things while they were still telling stories. That's something, I suppose. They'll be back tomorrow night. It'll give me something to do. Coat poked his spoon idly into the stew. I should have bought the Skraeling from Carter, he mused. He could have used the money for a new horse. People would have come from all over to see it. We could have had some business for a change. Bast gave him a speechless, horrified look. Coat made a pacifying gesture with the hand that still held the spoon. I'm joking, Bast. He gave a weak smile. Still, it would have been nice. No, Reshi, it most certainly would not have been nice, Bast said emphatically. People would come from all over to see it, he repeated derisively. Indeed. The business would have been nice, Coat clarified. Busyness would be nice. He jabbed his spoon into the stew again. Anything would be nice. They sat for a long moment, Coat scowling down into the bowl of stew in his hands, his eyes far away. It must be awful for you here, Bast, he said at last. You must be numb with boredom. Bast shrugged. There are a few young wives in town, scattering of daughters. He grinned like a child. I tend to make my own fun. That's good, Bast. There was another silence. Coat took another spoonful, chewed and swallowed. They thought it was a demon, you know. Bass shrugged. It might as well be, Reshi. It's probably the best thing for them to think. I know. I encouraged them, in fact. But you know what that means. He met Bass's eyes. The blacksmith is going to be doing a brisk business in the next couple of days. Bass's expression went carefully blank. Oh. Coat nodded. Won't blame you if you want to leave, Bast. You have better places to be than this. Bass's expression was shocked. I couldn't leave, Reshi. He opened and closed his mouth a few times, at a loss for words. Who else would teach me? Coat grinned, and for a moment his face showed how truly young he was. Behind the weary lines and the placid innkeeper's expression, he looked no older than his dark-haired companion. Who indeed? He gestured toward the door with his spoon. Go do your reading, then, or bother someone's daughter. I'm sure you have better things to do than watch me eat. Actually, begone, demon, Coat said, switching to a thickly accented Temic through half a mouthful of stool. Tears onto us, aha. Bass burst into startled laughter and made an obscene gesture with one hand. Coat swallowed and changed languages. Arroy te denanalan. Oh, come now, Bass reproached, a smile failing away. That's just insulting. By earth and stone, I abhor you. Coat dipped his fingers into the cup by his side and flicked droplets casually in Bass's direction. Glamour be banished. With cider? Bass managed to look amused and annoyed at the same time as he dabbed a bead of liquid from the front of his shirt. This better not stain. Coat took another bite of his dinner. Go soak it. If the situation becomes desperate, I recommend you avail yourself to the numerous solvent formula extant in Selim Tintur. Chapter 13, I believe. Fine. Bass stood and walked to the door, stepping with his strange, casual grace. Call if you need anything. He closed the door behind himself. Coat ate slowly, mopping up the last of the stew with a piece of bread. He looked out the window as he ate, or tried to, as the lamplight turned its surface mirror-like against the dark behind it. His eyes wandered the room restlessly. The fireplace was made of the same black rock as the one downstairs. It stood in the center of the room, a minor feat of engineering of which Coat was rather proud. The bed was small, little more than a cot, and if you were to touch it, you would find the mattress almost non-existent. A skilled observer might notice there was something his gaze avoided, the same way you avoid meeting the eye of an old lover at a formal dinner, or that of an old enemy sitting across the room in a crowded alehouse late at night. Coat tried to relax, failed, fidgeted, sighed, shifted in his seat, and without willing it, his eyes fell on the chest at the foot of his bed. It was made of roa, a rare, heavy wood, dark as coal and smooth as polished glass. Prized by perfumers and alchemists, a piece the size of your thumb was easily worth gold. To have a chest made of it went far beyond extravagance. The chest was sealed 3 times. It had a lock of iron, a lock of copper, and a lock that could not be seen. Tonight, the wood filled the room with an almost imperceptible aroma of citrus and quenching iron. When Coat's eyes fell on the chest, they did not dart quickly away. They did not slide slyly to the side as if he would pretend it wasn't there at all. But in a moment of looking, his face regained all the lines the simple pleasures of the day had slowly smoothed away. The comfort of his bottles and books was erased in a second, leaving nothing behind his eyes but emptiness and ache. For a moment, fierce longing and regret warred across his face. Then they were gone, replaced by the weary face of an innkeeper, a man who called himself Coat. He sighed again without knowing it, and pushed himself to his feet. It was a long time before he walked past the chest to bed. Once in bed, it was a long time before he slept. As Coat had guessed, they came back to the Waystone the next night for dinner and drinks. There were a few half-hearted attempts at stories, but they died out quickly. No one was really in the mood. So it was still early in the evening when the discussion turned to matters of greater import. They chewed over the rumors that had come into town, most of them troubling. The penitent king was having a difficult time with the rebels in Reykjavik. This caused some concern, but only in a general way. Reykjavik was a long way off, and even Cobb, the most worldly of them, would be hard-pressed to find it on a map. They discussed the war in their own terms. Cobb predicted a 3rd levy tax after the harvests were in. No one argued, though there hadn't been a 3-bleeder year in living memory. Jake guessed the harvest would be good enough so the 3rd levy wouldn't break most families, except the Bentleys, who were on hard times anyway, and the Orisons, whose sheep kept disappearing, and Crazy Martin, who had planted all barley this year. Every farmer with half a brain had planted beans. That was one good thing about all the fighting. Soldiers ate beans, and prices would be high. After a few more drinks, deeper concerns were voiced. Deserters, soldiers, and other opportunists were thick on the roads, making even short trips risky. The roads were always bad, of course, in the same way that winter was always cold. You complained, took sensible precautions, and got on with the business of living your life. But this was different. Over the last 2 months, the roads had become so bad that people had stopped complaining. The last caravan had 2 wagons and 4 guards. The merchant had been asking 10 pennies for half a pound of salt, 15 for a loaf of sugar. He didn't have any pepper or cinnamon or chocolate. He did have 1 small sack of coffee, but he wanted 2 silver talents for that. At first people had laughed at his prices. Then, when he held firm, folk had spat and cursed at him. That had been 2 span ago. 22 days. There had not been another serious trader since, even though this was the season for it. So despite the third levy tax looming large in everyone's minds, people were looking in their purses and wishing they'd bought a little something, just in case the snow came early. No one spoke of the previous night, of the thing they had burned and buried. Other folk were talking, of course. The town was alive with gossip. Carter's wounds ensured that the stories were taken half seriously, but not much more than half. The word demon was being spoken, but it was with smiles, half hidden behind raised hands. Only the 6 friends had seen the thing before it was burned. One of them had been wounded, and the others had been drinking. That priest had seen it too, but it was his job to see demons. Demons were good for his business. The innkeeper had seen it too, apparently, but he wasn't from around here. He couldn't know the truth that was so apparent to everyone born and raised in this little town. Stories were told here, but they happened somewhere else. This was not a place for demons. Besides, things were bad enough without borrowing trouble. Cobb and the rest knew there was no sense talking about it. Trying to convince folk would only make them a laughingstock, like Crazy Martin, who had been trying to dig a well inside his own house for years now. Still, each of them bought a piece of cold wrought iron from the smith, heavy as they could swing, and none of them said what they were thinking. Instead, they complained about the roads. They complained that the roads were bad and getting worse. They talked about merchants and deserters and levies, and not enough salt to last the winter. They reminisced about that 3 years ago no one would have even thought of locking their doors at night, let alone barring them. The conversation took a downward turn from there, and even though none of them said what they were thinking, the evening ended on a grim note. Most evenings did these days, times being what they were. End of Chapter 1. Please tune in next time for Chapter 2 of the Kingkiller Chronicle, Name of the Wind.